Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 26 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Now, there is just so much happening at the moment. The vast majority of people struggle to stay abreast of unfolding events. So many people tend to focus on a single event whilst ignoring the bigger picture. And because there is so much happening, even the most capable and competent researchers tend to overlook some of the detail because they're skimming and then looking at something else. And we're all guilty of that. I'm not pointing the finger at any individual. I'm guilty of it myself. So what I want to do is try and dig a little bit deeper under something that is clearly impacting upon all of us. And it's the classic. We need to look at a little bit of history because everything that is happening is scripted. I always make the observation that I don't claim any special insight. I simply read the scripts. And some of those scripts are in documents that we're never meant to find. They are in the public domain, but they are buried very, very deep indeed, and one almost has to stumble upon them. So tonight, I just want to go back to late in the last century, to 1997, and the publication of this book. We see on screen here, Zbigniew Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard. Now, we've discussed Brzezinski on previous editions of Humanity versus Insanity, with particular reference to his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Era, and the fact that he was effectively updating Technocracy Inc., published by Marion King Hubbard and Howard Scott in 1932. Well, Brzezinski was out of presidential favor during the 1990s, and although he is ostensibly the Democratic version of Henry Kissinger, and when I say Democratic version, I mean advisor to the Democrats, the political party, not democratic per se. So Brzezinski, of course, was a prime mover in establishing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979. And there are numerous pictures of Brzezinski in Afghanistan meeting with the leaders of the Mujahideen as the US financed and trained the Afghanistani fighters to combat the Russian military. And of course, if we look at history, then actually nobody has successfully invaded and conquered Afghanistan. But Brzezinski, could be argued, was the founder of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda, as Robin Cook so eloquently explained in his resignation speech, means database. And effectively, the Mujahideen were being trained, and the US military trainers were logging the names against the training and the weaponry that each of the Mujahideen fighters had had. Thus, the database, Al-Qaeda. Of course, Al-Qaeda has morphed. But Brzezinski, in his Grand Chessboard, made it very clear that the central arena in the chessboard in the coming century was going to be this area here. And as we can see on the map here, we are effectively looking at the Middle East. Here is Egypt, right through to Iran, and then right up into the various Islamic states that were formerly part of the Soviet Empire. So here was Brzezinski spelling out that this was going to be the focus of the geopolitical arena in the coming century. Well, Brzezinski's work was effectively used as the model for this document, which we've also discussed on previous editions of Humanity versus Insanity. And this is Rebuilding America's Defenses. This is the extreme right-wing, the neocon think tank that wrote to Clinton in 1998, effectively demanding that he invade Iraq right there and right then, which of course he refused to do. But 1 year before the a few months before the election, literally 2 months before the election in 2000, this document was published. And this is, again, freely available from the PNAC website, the Project for a New American Century. Just search for PNAC, PNAC.com, and Rebuilding America's Defenses, and you can find this PDF. So despite the fact that it's a little over 14 years old, this is an absolutely essential read for anybody who really wants to get the inside track on what's occurring right now in the global arena. And can we come back to that shot just for a second? Because one of the quotes in there was taken almost verbatim from Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard. And Brzezinski was acknowledging in his book that America, being the only superpower, his term, at the time, needed to up its game in terms of establishing its global hegemony, but recognizing that the American people would not support that agenda unless they felt under threat. And so Brzezinski's phrase was paraphrased by PNAC, and you see on the front of the document there, I've extracted the phrase, I think it was page 51, it says, "Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Domestic policies and industrial policy will shape the pace and content of transformation as much as the requirements of current missions." Well, of course, 2 months later, George Bush was effectively awarded the US presidency by the Supreme Court. And then once George Bush took office, there was no sign of him at the White House, because over the next nearly 9 months, he was at the White House for just 19 days. The rest of the time, he was either playing golf or down on his ranch in Crawford, Texas. Well, on, of course, 9/11 of 2001, the USA got its new Pearl Harbor, or one should perhaps say the neocons got their new Pearl Harbor. Now, of course, we made reference to this event last week because David Cameron had made reference to it on the previous Thursday in the UN when he likened those who had the audacity to question the official version of events of 9/11 and indeed the London bombings on 7/7 were effectively non-violent domestic extremists and should be treated in the same way as ISIS. The absurdity of this statement, of course, is not lost on anybody. But let's look a little bit deeper. Let's look at perhaps some of the belief system of those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. Of course, the worldview of the vast majority of people is a construct. It's a construct created by education and media. Whereas those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers share snippets of their belief system with their acolytes, with their puppets, with their useful idiots. And one of the things that perhaps is very interesting is the fact that this tarot card, can we bring this on screen? Here we go, the Tower tarot card. And one tarot expert described it to me. The Tower is a card about war, a war between the structures of lies and the lightning flash of truth. This is a card about anything we believe to be true, but later learn to be false. This realization usually comes as a shock, hence the violent image. It is quite simply that moment in any story where someone finds out a shocking truth, one that shatters their perceptions and makes them reassess their beliefs. Now, the irony is that I had my Tower moment almost exactly a decade earlier, in fact, in late March and early April of 1991, when I went into Kuwait in the immediate aftermath of the First Gulf War. And what I witnessed in Kuwait made me realize that my worldview was somewhat lacking and that there was an alternative sequence of events unfolding that were way beyond the perception of the vast majority of people who were basing their worldview on what they saw on CNN. Now, in 1991, that was at least 5 years before the emergence of the internet. And even in the late 90s, it certainly wasn't the repository of information that we have today. Although that in the late 90s and early part of this century, one might argue that that repository of information was a little bit more independent than it is right now. Certainly the search process today has to be filtered dramatically because it is controlled by the global corporatists. Well, there's no question that 9/11 was a significant factor in challenging the existing worldview of a lot of people. And it was perhaps slow burn, because certainly in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when I was spending pretty much 24 hours a day researching this event, there was about 24 of us who were focused on this, and we knew each other because we were sharing information. But today, of course, the number of people who question the events of 9/11 runs into many tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, and maybe even millions. And so consequently, 9/11 has in many cases actually proved to be a very positive event in terms of shaking people out of their construct. But there's still a long way to go. And despite numerous other events over the past 13 years, people still need to be awoken from their slumbers in the matrix. And it's become a real challenge. Whilst the establishment is, of course, doing everything it possibly can to force people to stay on the hamster wheel, to run at an ever faster pace, just to keep a roof over the head and food on the table. Yet an increasing number of people are saying, hang on a goddamn second. And they're either slowing right down on that hamster wheel or stepping right off. Well, I know that the issue I'm going to touch this evening is very sensitive, particularly, I'm sure, to the people of Salford. And let me make it very clear. I have no intent to cause any offence, but I simply ask questions in the interests of truth. And as is always the case, I don't expect anyone to accept anything I say, and certainly I don't claim that I have the definitive view. But I think that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed. And that, as with 9/11, the more people that look at this issue, then the more intellect, the more independent thought we bring to the process, and the greater the likelihood that we're able to remove the veneer and see the real truth. So let's go back to shortly after the events of 9/11 and the tragic death of Daniel Pearl on the 1st of February 2002. And of course, this was really part of the manipulation of the US public. Of course, this was the US were already into Afghanistan by this time, and George W. Bush was effectively ramping up the rhetoric to get the population of the US behind him to launch yet another attack on Iraq. Now, what is interesting is that in 2007, allegedly, during an interrogation, the individual who was labelled as the 9/11 mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, during an interrogation actually claimed that he was responsible for beheading Daniel Pearl in 2002. But one has to remember that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had been waterboarded by his interrogators 183 times. Now, let me tell you that after the first waterboarding, I would have probably admitted to being Jack the Ripper. So the reality is that confession really has no validity whatsoever, along with anything else that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed claimed, because I'm sure that he wasn't finding the waterboarding experience to be particularly enjoyable. Well, move the clock forward to 2004. And the next unfortunate victim was Nick Berg. And this was in May of 2004. This was 1 year after the invasion of Iraq. But of course, what it did was it maintained the antipathy of the American public against the Islamic terrorists. Well, then we go through a period of a little over 10 years, and we come right up to the latest series, a sequence of beheadings. And I think I may have got the date wrong here, because I think that James Foley was actually beheaded in August, if he was beheaded. Because as I made the observation last week, the videos that have been released certainly do not look genuine to me. And only, I think today, Naomi Wolf was lambasted in the British media for having the audacity to question the authenticity of these videos that have been released featuring Jihadi John. And Naomi Wolf, as a accredited journalist, simply makes the observation that normal journalistic practice is that before anything is reported, it should be verified by at least 2 independent sources. And apparently one American mainstream outlet claimed, well, it had to be true because it was all over YouTube. Oh, really? Well, that's a bit like us in the UK saying, well, it must be true because it was in the Sun. Well, the 4 videos that have been released over the last month and a half or so now, of course, James Foley, then followed by Stephen Sotloff, this time an American Israeli of dual nationality, and once again featuring Jihadi John, featuring very similar backdrop. And I must confess that I and a number of others have looked at this, and we consider there's a distinct possibility that this was a green screen setup. Then we have the 2 Brits, David Haynes on the 13th of September, and then, of course, in the last few days, Alan Henning of Salford. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that these individuals are perhaps still alive. I'd love to think they were. But Naomi Wolf asks some very pertinent questions in her article, which is certainly still currently on the Daily Mail online website. So please do take a look at that, because more and more journalists are starting to ask the pertinent questions. The videos do not look genuine. The behavior of the 4 alleged victims are not consistent with somebody who is literally about to go to their death. Were they drugged? Who knows? But even the aftermath, showing the body and the severed head, certainly does not look genuine. Medical professionals have questioned the apparent lack of blood and the fact that there is no blood, despite the apparent scything across the throat of the knife. So, over the course of the last decade, we have had 6 beheadings that have been reported, but the sources have been somewhat dubious. In most cases, it is single source. And as Naomi Wolf says, were these people actually captured? Was there any record of them being in the custody of Islamic extremists? Because these records are normally, fastidiously maintained by the likes of Amnesty International. So the questions are being asked, and yet the establishment seems reluctant to respond. Well, this came to the fore a few days ago. This was brought to my attention, and it's actually from an article that was written in the immediate aftermath of Daniel Pearl's beheading. And this is the depiction on the apron of the 9th to 11th degrees in the Memphis Mitzrayim Brotherhood. Now, the Memphis Mitzrayim, by the way, is simply a plural for Egyptian. So this is an Egyptian Masonic rite. And of course, the link between the Egyptian Masonic rite and the name ISIS, will not be missed on any of the viewers out there. But let's go back to that graphic there. And let's have a look here, because obviously we've got the 9, and the 9 is effectively dissected by the short knife there, the dagger. This represents the 9 to the 11th degree. As you can see, what we have there is the beheading, the separation of the head from the torso by a long knife, or the Arabic sword. And the initiation rite in the Memphis Mitzrayim ritual here is all about realizing the truth. It's about leaving behind the lies, the deceit, the deception of the material realm and coming into a new realization. Well, let me share with you the insights of Bill Schnoebelen, who's an author, a writer on Freemasonry. And here's what he has to say. Memphis Mitzrayim is a little-known Masonic group based upon Arab and Egyptian magic. As such, they are deeply satanic and very powerful. They are very deep and satanic, very powerful throughout the Middle East. Any Arabic Mason who dares to disobey the edict of the top commander of Memphis Mitzrayim stands in dire danger of death. This group is very powerful and feared. However, their top commander is controlled by the top leadership of Illuminized Freemasonry. So consider the possibility. And I know for many people, of course, this is so far outside their bounds of perception, they will have probably already switched off. But for those who have developed and are continuing to develop the capacity of independent thought, then perhaps this is something that is seriously worth pursuing. Is Jihadi John a member of this particular Freemasonic rite? Is he carrying out the instructions of the international Illuminized Freemasonry? Are the internationalists, the socio-psychopathic global corporatists, literally manipulating the world into their much vaunted World War III? And of course, students of Albert Pike and his morals and dogma will be very aware that this is exactly what he was writing about nearly a century and a half ago, stipulating in his writings that the world would need 3 world wars to bring about the New World Order, effectively the global corporatist fascist state. Now, how is this when supposedly we have a free press? How is this when we have apparently independent investigative journalists? Well, of course, as many people watching this will know, we don't. The reality is that the vast majority of journalists who work for the mainstream media today are literally instructed what it is that they have to put out there. Many of them are simply cut and paste merchants. The true investigative journalist is a thing of the past in the mainstream and now generally works in the alternative media. Well, I want to share the insights with you of Dr. Udo Othkott. I think I've pronounced his name correctly. Well, he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Bought Journalism. Now, this book is number 7 on the on Amazon's bestseller list, and it's a 13-minute interview. Now, unfortunately, we can only hear one side of the discussion, and that's his side. But he was an insider. He was a bought and paid for media whore by his own admission. So this is a guy who has turned whistleblower. Listen to what he has to say.
it is not right what I have done in the past, to manipulate people, to make propaganda against Russia, and it is not right what my colleagues do and have done in the past, because they are bribed to betray the people, not only in Germany, all over Europe. The reason writing this book was that I am very fearful of a new war in Europe, and I don't like to have this situation again, because war is never coming from itself. There is always people behind it to push for war. And this is not only politicians, this is journalists too. And I just have written in the book how we have betrayed in the past our readers just to push for war, and because I don't want this anymore. I'm fed up with this propaganda. We live in a banana republic and not in a democratic country where we have press freedom, where we have human rights. If you see the German media, especially my colleagues who day by day write against the Russians, who are in transatlantic organizations and who are supported by the United States to do so, well, people like me, I became an honorary citizen of the state of Oklahoma in the United States. Just why? Just because I write pro-American. I wrote pro-American. I was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the CIA. Why? Because I should be pro-American. I'm fed up with it. I don't want to do it anymore. And so I've just written a book not to earn money. No, it will cause a lot of trouble for me, just to give the people in this country, in Germany, in Europe, and all over the world, just to give them a glimpse of a view what goes up behind the closed doors. Yes, there is many examples for that. If we go just back to history, if you go into the year 1988, if you go to your archives, you will find in March 1988 there was in Iraq, in Iraq, the Kurdish people have been gassed with poisoned gas. That is known all over the world. But in July 1988, they sent me to a town called Zubaydat, that is on the Iraqi-Iranian border. There was war. It was war between the Iranians and the Iraqis, and I was sent there to photograph how the Iranians have been gassed with poisoned gas, with German poisoned gas. You call it Lost and Zarine, mustard gas, made by Germany. They have been gassed, and I was there to make photographs how these people have been killed by poisoned gas from Germany. When I came back to Germany, there was just one small photo in a newspaper, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and there was one small article not writing how impressive, brutally, how unhuman, how terrible it was to kill decades after the end of the Second World War, people with German poisoned gas. So this was a situation I feel misused for having been there, and just to give a documentary what has been done, but not being allowed to cry out to the world what we have done behind closed doors. Up to today, it's not well known in the public that with German public gas, there have been hundreds or thousands of people gassed in this city of Zubaydat. Now you ask, what have I done for intelligence agencies? So please see, most of the journalists you see in foreign countries, they claim to be journalists, and they might be journalists, European or American journalists, but many of them, like me in the past, are so-called non-official cover. That's what the Americans call that. I have been a non-official cover. Non-official cover means what? It means you too work for an intelligence agency. You help them if they want you to help them, but they will never, when you are locked, or when they find out that you are not only a journalist but a spy too, they will never say, oh, this was one of our guys. They will not know you. That means non-official cover. So I have helped them in several situations, And I feel ashamed for that too now. Like I feel ashamed that I have worked for a very recommended newspaper like the Frankfurter Allgemeine, because I was bribed by billionaires, I was bribed by the Americans not to report exactly the truth, but I just imagined in my car while I was driving to this interview, I just tried to work out in my brain what would have happened if I would have written a pro-Russian article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Well, I don't know what would have happened, but we were all educated to write pro-European, pro-American, but please, not pro-Russian. So I'm very sorry for that, but this is not what I understand for democracy and for press freedom. I'm very sorry for that. Well, yes, I understand your question very well. Germany is still a kind of a colony of the United States. You see that in many points, like the majority of the Germans don't want to have nukes in our country, but we still have American nukes. So we are still a kind of a colony of the Americans. And being a colony, it is very easy to approach young journalists through what is very important here is transatlantic organizations. All journalists from really respected and recommended big German newspapers, magazines, radio stations, TV stations, they are all members or guests of those big transatlantic organizations. And there, in these transatlantic organizations, you are approached to be pro-American, and there is nobody coming to you and saying, well, we are the Central Intelligence Agency, would you like to work for us? No, this is not the case how it happens. What they do, these transatlantic organizations, is they invite you for seeing the United States. They pay for that, they pay all your expenses and everything. So you are bribed, you get more and more corrupt, because they make you good contacts. You won't know that those good contacts are, let's say, non-official covers, or officially people working for Central Intelligence Agency or other American agencies. So you make friends. You think they are friends, and you cooperate with them. They ask you, well, could you do me this favor? Could you do me that favor? And so your brain more and more is brainwashed through these guys. And your question was, is this only the case with German journalists? No, I think it is especially the case with British journalists, because they have a much closer relationship. It is especially the case with Israelis, of course with French journalists for a part, not that big as with German or with British journalists. It is the case for Australian journalists, for journalists from New Zealand, from Taiwan, from, well, there is many countries in the Arab world, like Jordan, for example, like Oman, the Sultanate of Oman. There is many countries where this happens, where you find people to claim they are respected journalists, but if you look behind them, you'll find they are puppets on a string of the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm sorry in interrupting you. I'll give you one example. Sometimes the intelligence agencies, they come to your office and want you to write an article. I give you an example not from strange other journalists, from me myself. I've just forgotten the year. I just remember that the German Foreign Intelligence, Bundesnachrichtendienst, it is just a sister organization of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was founded by the American Intelligence Agency. So one day, the BND, this German Foreign Intelligence Agency, came to my office at the Frankfurter Allgemeine in Frankfurt. And they wanted me to write an article about Libya and about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. I had absolutely no secret informations regarding Colonel Muammar Gaddafi and Libya. But they gave me all these secret informations, and they just wanted me to write, to sign the article with my name. I did that, but it was an article that was published in the Frankfurter Allgemeine that originally came from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, from the German Foreign Intelligence Agency. So do you really think that this is journalism, intelligence agencies writing articles? Oh yes, that article, I have reprinted it partly in my book. That article was how Libya and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, how he secretly tried to build a poison gas factory, I think in Rabta was the name, yeah. And I got all those informations. It was a story that was printed worldwide 2 days later. But I had no information on that. It was the intelligence agencies that wanted me to write this article. So, but this is not the way journalism should work, that intelligence agencies, that they decide what is printed and what not. If I say no, I give you an example from a very good example if you say no. Well, we have a rescue unit in Germany with helicopters for traffic accidents. It's called, they call themselves the Yellow Angels. There was one guy who didn't want to cooperate. He was a pilot of the helicopter service of the Yellow Angels in Germany. This guy said no to the Foreign Intelligence Service, Bundesnachrichtendienst, when they approached him and wanted him as a non-official cover to work for the German Foreign Intelligence Agency, under, just to pretend to be somebody from the Yellow Angels. So what happened was that he lost his job. And the court in Germany, the judge decided that they were right because such a guy could not be trusted. He was kicked off his job because he didn't cooperate with the Foreign Intelligence Service. So I knew what would happen if I would not cooperate with intelligence services. Well, I have had, let me say, 6 times my house was house searched because I was accused by the public prosecutor, the German public prosecutor. I was accused of leaking secrets of states. 6 times house searched. Well, they hoped that I wouldn't do that ever again. But I think it's worse that the truth will come out one day. The truth won't die. And I don't mind what will happen. I've had 3 heart attacks. I have no children. So if they want to bring me to court or to prison, so it's worse for the truth. Well, I've been a journalist.
So what we have there is the whistleblower explaining how journalists are all effectively bought and paid for, some without even realizing it. Meanwhile, of course, the politicians have to effectively present them with the raw material so they can cut and paste it into the columns. And those of you who were watching last week's show will remember I made a reference to David Cameron's presentation, it's now Thursday week ago, in the UN, in fact, just a few hours before he recalled Parliament to get the sanction to launch military attacks on ISIS, ISIL, as he referred to them, Islamic State, and obviously needing to overturn the parliamentary decision from 2013. So Cameron, here he is, determined to confront ISIS, and in that presentation he said, non-violent conspiracy theorists are just as dangerous as Islamic State. Actually making the observation that those who peddled misinformation about events like 9/11 and 7/7 were just as dangerous as ISIS. Well, this, of course, is the reason that the British establishment tried to present the view that it would be illegal to watch any of the videos that had allegedly been posted by Jihadi John and his cohorts as they beheaded their unfortunate victims. Well, the reason, of course, that it was necessary to make it illegal was because the more discerning viewer might actually pick up on the fact that they might not be genuine. So even the mainstream journalists that did question the veracity of those reports were, of course, bribed, browbeaten, or bullied into silence. Well, of course, where Cameron is heading with this is to challenge the supremacy in British law of the Human Rights Act. And he is using Islamic State as the excuse. And the phrase that we are hearing more and more in the British media is his desire, and we can see it here on the screen, to axe the hated Human Rights Act. Hated by whom? Well, it's certainly hated by the socio-psychopathic global corporatists, because it is the human rights legislation that effectively permits free speech, that effectively permits the right to assembly, the basic right to protest. So when Cameron talks about getting rid of human rights legislation, it really has very little to do with what's occurring in the Middle East, and is simply being used, which is simply being used as an excuse to get rid of this legislation. Well, Theresa May, of course, at the Tory party conference, went a stage further and made the observation that the Tory government needs to introduce a snooper's charter. In other words, basically what she is saying is that the security services and the police need carte blanche to be able to access the personal data of basically anyone they deem a potential threat to the state, whether that's violent or non-violent. In other words, anybody who dares to use what was once described as the democratic process and free speech to challenge the establishment. Well, Tony Abbott actually got in ahead of her. Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, and he has now absolutely stated that it is going to be necessary to reduce freedoms, to remove freedoms, to save lives from the terrorism threat. Well, let's just have a quick look at the risk that Australians face to terrorism. This is causes of death between 2003 and 2012, but to really sort of get a decent number, the terrorism line has been extended to 1978. So you can see that the top cause of death in Australia over the period of 2003-2012 was actually suicide. Nearly 3 times as many suicides as car accidents, and nearly 10 times as many suicides as homicides. Diabetes creeping up at the top there. Way down the list is terrorism at 113. Now, at a quick glance today, I was able to establish where about 105 of those were, I think it is. The IRA killed 2. That was a case of mistaken identity, I think, back in 1990. In 9/11, there were 11 Australians killed. But, of course, the bulk of the Australians killed as a result of terrorism were the Bali 1 bomb in October 2002, which, again, the physical evidence does not support the official story. And it was, of course, a very conveniently timed event to persuade Australians that they needed to join the coalition of the willing in the invasion of Iraq. Now, we're running out of time, so we don't even have the time this evening to touch on Ebola and the rising cases of Ebola. Now, there is something not right about this either. And there may not be an issue of Humanity versus Insanity next week, because I should be up in North Yorkshire. But we will be following up on this story in 2 weeks' time. Meanwhile, I'm going out to Tony Abbott land, and I'm going to be participating in a series of events in Australia, covering Perth, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. These events are being organised by Freedom Summits. So if you want more information, look at the other speakers, an outstanding lineup. It's www.freedomsummits.org. And I'm just going to leave you tonight with this thought. You're either with us or you're with the socio-psychopathic global corporatists. Deciding that you're not going to get involved, deciding that you're not going to do anything to challenge this agenda is no longer appropriate. That's why the title of my talks in Australia, we can put it back on the screen there, thank you, is Apathy Kills, the greatest threat to humanity ever. Thank you for joining me. See you in 45 minutes of Fracking Nightmare.